Piecing together the evidence needed to fully understand the Lockerbie disaster posed an enormous challenge for those leading the investigation.
Obviously there were luggage scattered all over the place. Because of the high winds, we actually recovered documentation from the North Sea, which is 60 miles away. We searched 848 square miles of country round about here, collecting pieces of aircraft and as much luggage as we could find. Between Lockerbie and the part out at Tundergarth, there was bodies strewn across the golf course and across the hillsides, and we just didn't know exactly where you were going to find people. We found them in woods, we found them up trees, we found them in roofs in the houses in Lockerbie. One in particular, one gentleman had obviously been blown out of the plane when it happened, and we found him 5 miles off course, still strapped into his seat.
A lot of young lads involved, especially young soldiers, who had never, I don't think, seen a dead body, and they were tasked with forming lines to walk the fields round about Lockerbie to try and pinpoint all these bodies, and I'm quite sure a lot of these lads will still be suffering yet from nerves of what they saw. There were holes in the shape of the body where the body had initially struck the ground, and they'd be anything from 2 to 8 inches deep. And all these holes, we were given a list of where every body was, or every body part, and these holes had to be filled in with soil, and they had to be seeded with the same grass seed as was growing in that field, and it was quite a task. There was a lot of bodies.
But in what would quickly become one of the largest murder cases in Britain, even the most grisly of tasks needed to be performed, including more than 200 autopsies once the bodies had been retrieved. Initially, it was here in Lockerbie's town hall that pathologist Tony Busuttil and his forensic team set up a temporary mortuary.
When people envisage the town hall as being the disaster mortuary, the last thing they had on their minds is that we were going to do post-mortems, and post-mortems on 200 plus people.
Instead, the town's ice ring was transformed into a massive morgue where teams worked examining the bodies, documenting the biggest cuts to the smallest abrasions. In most cases, the injuries were massive. Having fallen from 31,000 feet, some were damaged beyond recognition.
Bodies are literally sucked out of the plane, and then they hurtle down. Obviously, if they're not dead, they're unconscious, they're deeply unconscious if they're dead. Indeed, there's no rigor, there's no stiffening of the body. So the bodies are floating, arms and legs flailing. And indeed, we call that a windmilling effect. And in that process, the clothing comes off the bodies.
The horrifying question people were asking, could some of the passengers of Pan Am 103 been alive when they hit the earth below?
There were 2 persons who had injuries which may, and simply may, have been compatible with life.
For the families of the victims who arrived in Lockerbie in the days following the disaster, the reality of how their loved ones died was devastating.
I mean, how do you deal with someone who comes in and says, I've come to find out what happened to my relatives. I got the reputation of being the chap to go and see.
There were several main big difficulties for families arriving here. First of all, disbelief. That their son or their daughter or husband or wife had died. Maybe they hadn't died, they'd be saying to themselves, maybe it was some fluke, they've survived. And some people went for a long time saying to themselves, oh no, they'll still be alive somewhere. Strange experience. The second thing they wanted to do was to find the body. And the third thing they wanted to do was take the body home. all they had to do was look at me. I call it the Lockerbie eyes. After a while you get Lockerbie eyes because you've absorbed so much, possibly. And when you meet people, they're half expecting you to be giving them a holy answer, but they might not even be wanting to talk to you at all. What has a man of God got to offer in a situation like that, you know? Is he going to come up with a holy answer? But when I met any of the families, all they had to do was look at me and they knew here's a man who's really suffering.
The deepest grief today is felt by Joanne's brothers, Stephen and David.
For Father Patrick Keegans, who had barely escaped death himself, he would also have to bury his neighbours and friends.
Joanne Flanagan's funeral was the first funeral here in Lockerbie, and it was in the Catholic Church. And it was really a tremendously hard thing to do. But I think even at that point I was beginning to get to the stage where I was almost trying to be in control. Because there are times when you can't allow yourself to crack up. You cannot allow yourself to crack up.
But for young Stephen Flanagan, Lockerbie would haunt him for the rest of his life, until tragically, he too would be killed in a train accident years later and buried alongside his family.
Life would have been different for Stephen Flanagan had his mum and dad and his sister still been alive.
But it was not just Lockerbie which lost its sons and daughters. Families from 21 countries were mourning the taking of innocent life. Tracking the killers would not take months but years, until 1991, when warrants were issued for 2 Libyans, Abdel Basit al-Magrahi and Alamin Khalifa Fima. 12 years later, the pair would finally face a special court in the Netherlands.
What they did was they listed a whole number of factors and said, from that we infer that Magrahi's guilty. For example, they found a bit of the timer, and the timer was made by a company called Mibo in Switzerland. They supplied this particular type of timer mainly to Libya. Libya intelligence had an office next door to Mibo in Switzerland. The case was inference upon inference leading to an inference. Yeah, it's something like an inference too far.
Even as the trial went on, many of us were saying, this is farcical. We felt it was some sort of charade.
But it would only be Magrahi found guilty of murder, the sole person convicted over the deaths of 270 people. Rather than provide closure, his sentence prompted more questions.
They're now shouting again that Abdul Basit al-Magrahi is innocent. I don't know. I don't think he's innocent, but he'll only be one of very many. And at the end of the day, the truth will never be told about this.
My view on this is I don't know whether Magrahi was involved in blowing up Pan Am 103 or not. What I do think is that the prosecution did not prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he was involved in the bombing of the plane.
Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's government formally accepted responsibility for the bombing in 2003, paying millions of dollars compensation to the victims' families. Economic sanctions imposed on Libya for not allowing Magrahi's extradition were lifted, allowing them to return from the political wilderness and resume lucrative foreign trade of natural resources. Magrahi's release, though, will only add to the controversy surrounding the bombing.
If the appeal's successful, then I would expect them to go back to Libya as a hero. The Libyans don't want to create more fuss. They've moved over the years from bad guys to good guys. And it's cost them a lot.
It makes me angry, you know, that the investigation didn't go the full road. I think the truth helps us to heal. Lies and deceptions just add to grief.
Though today, as the planes continue to fly overhead, time may blur the memories, but it will never erase what happened. What happened in the town of Lockerbie.
It's difficult. I would say something I wish I had never been involved in. I could have lived my life without being associated with anything like Lockerbie. It happened, and I think we dealt with it as the best we could.
You know, when the house was falling, I thought about my husband. But all I could see in my mind's eyes were my 3 kids, my children. And I said out loud, I never really tell them I love them, we just take it for granted. I don't now. I tell them now.
This will be my home till the end of my days, I think. But no, it's sad that Lockerbie is known the world over for all the wrong reasons, i.e. an incident like this. Known for all the wrong reasons. It's not because it's a pretty little borders town as it's made out in the media. It's where Pan Am jumbo jet landed.